Medea Benjamin is the co-founder of the women-led peace group Code Pink. Medea has been an advocate for social justice for 50 years, described as one of America's most committed and most effective fighters for human rights, and one of the high-profile leaders of the peace movement. She was one of 1,000 exemplary women from 140 countries nominated to receive the Nobel Peace Prize on behalf of the millions of women who do the essential work of peace worldwide. She's also the author of 10 books, including her most recent book, co-authored with Nicolas J.S. Davies, War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. Medea, welcome to the program.
So nice to be with you. Thank you for having me on.
I am really very honored and very pleased to have you on the program. War in Ukraine, Making Sense of a Senseless Conflict. It's the title of your book. Why do you say this is a senseless war? And I suppose the second part of that question would be, could this war have been avoided?
Well, I suppose at one level we can say that all wars are senseless and all wars could have been avoided. But we're talking about this particular war that was a war foretold. It was a war that decades ago, back in early 1990s, there was already talk about how if NATO expands, that will lead to a conflict with Russia. We heard that for the last several decades. Yeah. And as NATO kept expanding and kept getting closer and closer, and then finally along Russia's border, more and more people in Europe, in the US, and in Russia, of course, were saying, stop, this is not good. This is a provocation. This is a red line that is being crossed. So we explain very clearly in the book all the warnings that were given, all the ways that it was known to anybody paying attention at that time that what the US and NATO was doing was indeed provocative, was indeed making Russia feel insecure in its own borders and its own national security interests, and would lead to conflict. So here we are today. And that's why we say it's a senseless conflict that indeed, up until the very December of 2021, before the Russian invasion in February, there were proposals that Russia was putting on the table, basically saying, help, stop, let's sit down, let's talk about these things. And the US and the head of NATO just summarily dismissed all of those entreaties by Russia to talk. And then we had the February invasion.
Yeah, I'd like to just ask you to expand a little bit on the events around about the 19th, the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the promises that were made to the Russians, because there's not really much clarity on that. And it's not a much talked about subject. Not many people are talking about really, we tend to think the war started in February. And otherwise we tend to think, well, okay, fine, it started in 2014. We
Right.
don't really understand the background, the promises made, what happened to the Warsaw Pact, etc. Can you give us some context to all of that?
Well, yes, this was when Gorbachev was in power, when the Soviet Union was starting to unravel, when East and West Germany were in the process of becoming unified. And that was when Secretary of Baker, who was the Secretary of Defense of the United States, as well as the heads of West Germany, were talking to Gorbachev and saying, okay, if you allow for the reunification of Germany, and at that time was also when the Warsaw Pact, which was the counterpart for NATO, started to unravel, that the West promised that it wouldn't move, quote, one eastward towards Russia's border. And that, it wasn't a treaty in the sense that it wasn't written down and approved by both governments, but it was definitely something that was discussed many, many times, that was understood as an agreement. And there's a organization in the United States called the National Security Archives that does what we call Freedom of Information Acts to get more information out. And they now have a whole series of articles that shows all the ways that this was understood to be a serious agreement that was made between the U.S. and Russia and the Western countries in general, and that was the only way that it was going to work, is that Russia could not feel, as it was losing its empire, the Soviet empire, that it was going to be attacked by the West. And so the agreement was the NATO countries would not expand.
And of course, we have since then seen exactly the opposite of that. We've seen the continuous expansion of NATO. Question to you about these agreements that were made, or promises that were made. Are they, or were they also documented? Are they well documented discussions and agreements that were made?
That's why I say it wasn't written a document that turned into any kind of treaty.
Yeah.
It was an understanding that people who were involved at the time said was crystal clear. And that's why these documents that came out in the National Security Archives it document the discussions that went on various levels between the different parties. And we have in our book a number of different people, from the ambassadors to Russia at that time, from the people who were at various levels of different Western embassies at the time, and then people who were in the government in Russia as it was moving from the Soviet Union to be Russia, that this is something that was widely discussed and widely understood. And that's why I think anybody today who tries to pretend that this wasn't a promise that was violated is really not looking seriously at history. And, you know, on another level, you just have to understand that, of course, this would be part of the agreements that the heads of the Soviet Union would have made, in that they didn't want to give up what they had in the perestroika and the glasnost and the whole opening up of the Soviet Union. Had to be something in there that would guarantee that the West would not just come in and scoop them up. Now, let's remember the West did come in and scoop up a lot of the enterprises that were state-run enterprises and really messed up the Soviet economy in so many ways that the life expectancy and the well-being of the people just took a nosedive, and really led to the popularity that Putin had at the time that he came in, and that continues really to enjoy today. But I think the violation of the NATO countries is something that was widely resented within the powers of Russia.
Yeah. Let's just, I'd like to keep the focus on the sort of the evolution, the run up to this war. So I'd like you to tell us about 2014, Ukraine. Putin's argument is, of course, no expansion. Ukraine is the red line. But before we get to that, what happened in 2014, and what was America's role in, and why is that, in fact, in my view, really a kind of a jump off towards this war?
Yes, and let's remember that before that, there was the NATO meeting in Bucharest in 2008, in which the President Bush at that time was really arm twisting the other NATO countries to want to make a public statement that Ukraine and Georgia would be allowed into NATO. Yeah. Now, the many other countries in Europe understood that this was a very dangerous thing and didn't want to do it, which was why the statement that came out in 2008 was vague in terms of when it would happen, but was clear in saying that those two countries would be invited to join NATO. And certainly that was a very, very red line. And then you have the uprising in 2014. That was an uprising against a government that was elected and indeed was a corrupt government, Viktor Yanukovych, but it was a government that was pro-Russia, but also pro-Western. It's interesting because he's portrayed as being pro-Russian, but really he was somebody who wanted to see economic agreements signed between both the European Union and with Russia. Yet there was a popular uprising against him, and it was seen as something that really had a lot of grassroots support until it became hijacked. And when it became hijacked, it was hijacked by the extreme right, people with ties to neo-Nazi groups, and it became very violent. And as Yanukovych, with outside help, was trying to come to some kind of political agreement and say, all right, I guess there's going to have to be a transition government. Let's set up new elections. This very violent group refused to agree to that and instead stormed the parliament and demanded that Yanukovych leave immediately, and that in his place, then that's where the United States role came in, because it was the U.S. that handpicked who would be the next leader of Ukraine.
Yeah, and there was the famous telephone call of Victoria Nuland. Tell us about that.
Well, yes, it's so great that this telephone call became public information, because we would have never known the extent of U.S. involvement until maybe decades from now, when we were able to get the internal documents. But here we have this phone call that just lays it out in such incredible hubris of her saying how we were going to, she didn't use the word disregard the EU. She used a little more of an expletive for that. And instead, it was going to be the US that decided exactly who is going to come in what positions they would come in. And then we have also Victoria Nuland out in the middle of the protests, giving out donuts or cookies, sweets. When I talk to people in the United States, I say, try to imagine that during the uprising the Republicans did in our Congress on January 6th of last year, if there was somebody from the Russian government that came out to hand them out cookies and say, go forward, move, let's overthrow this government of the United States. It would just, it's not even thinkable. We laugh when we think about that. And yet that's what the United States was doing inside Ukraine, picking the next government and stopping the process that the grassroots had started, which would have been a nonviolent process with a new election, instead putting in a pro-European, anti-Russian head, which led to the breakaway republics in the Donbass and led to the civil war that killed 14,000 people. So this was a very violent coup and had very violent consequences.
Yeah. Would you go so far as to say that there is, in fact, then weight in Vladimir Putin calling 2014 a coup d'etat? Would you go that
absolutely,
far?
Absolutely. I think, when you see something that starts out as a grassroots nonviolent protest with masses of people involved, well, that's one thing. And that's something that I support when it happens around the world. But then when it turns out that it's not only violent elements that take over, but that foreign countries then come in to take advantage of this situation and overthrow a government that was elected, I would say that is a violent coup.
Yeah. You've clearly studied the region very well, and I'd like you to explain to me and to our listeners the eastern part of the country. That's the Russian part of the country. Can you give us some kind of a history there? Just fill that in for us so that we understand. Is it genuinely a historically a Russian part, or is it only mostly dominated by Russian speakers? What's the history in terms of the Donbass region?
Well, let's recognize that these borders have been fluctuating for many, many years, and that Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, that there are many Russian speakers and ethnic Russians who lived in that eastern part of the country, just like in Crimea, where the majority of the people there are ethnic Russians. And that Donbas region, people were going back and forth into Russia and Ukraine constantly. I have some friends who lived in the eastern part of Donbas who said that they weren't allowed to have movies in Russian in their village. And so they would cross the border every weekend to go see movies in Russia. This was a very fluid kind of border situation, but certainly many ethnic Russians who did feel discriminated against in the use of their language in the schools and their use of their language in the media, and felt a lot of affinity towards Russia.
Yeah, if you can tell me about the Kiev government. Zelensky, I know, is the man of the moment, or he's been up till now the man of the moment, the new kind of Superman of the world. But why this antagonism between the western part and the eastern part, and what is the history behind? And I know we've heard 14,000 people or 15,000 people died in since 2014. What in your mind was the political motivation behind that kind of antagonism coming from Kiev towards the eastern part? What's the motive behind that?
We have to talk about what happened in 2015, when there was actually an agreement to try to quell the unrest that happened after the coup in 2014. Mm-hmm. And when the coup in 2014 happened and those regions in the eastern part broke away and said, we want to be autonomous from the new pro-European government, and that's when a lot of the fighting took place. Mm-hmm. Then the international community stepped in to try to calm the situation. And these Minsk agreements, 1 and 2, were agreed upon by both Russia and Ukraine with outside support. Mm-hmm. Now, that was a very positive development in which the fighting eased quite a lot. And there was a political part of that, in which the leaders of Ukraine were supposed to meet with the breakaway republics and come up with a referendum for them to vote on what they wanted their status to be. They were supposed to be given autonomy by the Ukrainian government. This political part of the agreement was something that Zelensky himself he campaigned on when he was running for president, saying that I am going to bring peace to the region. I'm going to follow through. I'm going to meet with the leaders of the breakaway republics. Yet when he got to power, just like his predecessor, learned that when he tried to do that, he was confronted by these extreme right groups who said, no way. If you try to do that, you'll be hanging from a tree. They threatened him, and they didn't allow him to follow through on his agreements, not only to meet with the heads of the breakaway republic, but to withdraw the Ukrainian troops from that the civil strife region that had been identified and was being monitored by European monitors. And so the agreement was never implemented. And I think we also have to fault the West and the US for not pushing the Ukrainian government at that time to implement those agreements, because I do feel that if that were the case, that we would not be seeing the war today. It was the failure to implement those agreements that built up the hostility. And not only that, after the agreements were reached, instead of pushing Ukraine to follow through, what the West did was to start training the Ukrainian forces, 10,000 of them a year, pouring weapons into Ukraine. First, they said they were defensive weapons, and then they said, oh, what the heck, we're just going to go with offensive weapons. And that poured in. So the failure to implement the peace accords there, and the fact that Ukraine was becoming closer and closer militarily to the West, is something that was extremely antagonistic, not only to the ethnic Russians who were living in Ukraine, but also to Russia, that was being pushed by those groups inside Ukraine to say, come and help us.
Yeah. Let me just for one moment go a little bit back again to the, let's call it the relationship between Kiev and the East. Is this, and I know there's a lot of talk about the Russians went in there to denazify as well. There's a lot of talk about the power that the extreme right-wing groups do have in Kiev, the power that they even have over Zelensky as well. But is the basis of this antagonism, is that just simply ethnic hatred? Is there any historic cause for that? Why would Kiev so be down on the Russian the traditionally Russian people within that region? I'm trying to understand what is the cause for this antagonism between the West and the East.
I think we should look at it from the point of view of nationalism, and then the extreme nationalism of some of these extreme rightist groups that say that every inch of that territory belongs to Ukraine, and we have to claw that back.
Yeah.
So now we saw that in 2014, the antagonism against Russia and those who wanted Ukraine to be trading more with Russia, to be part of the Euro-Asian orbit rather than the Western orbit. I think that antagonism was building up, but I do think it's the extreme nationalism that, of course, when this war broke out, you see it in much more of a coming to the fore, but that existed all along from the time of the breakaway republics in Donbass.
We just talked about, and we understand Putin had been at it for the last 20 years, warning about this encroachment of NATO. And he's been saying the same thing over and over again. My question to you is, what in your mind was the straw that broke the back at the end of the day that propelled Putin to say, so far, no more, I'm now sending in my troops? Were there any events before February this year that gave Putin that impulse that, no more, I'm going to do this now?
Certainly the monitors that from the European countries that had been monitoring the dividing line in Donbass had registered quite a significant increase in strikes coming in from the Ukraine side into those breakaway republics. So there was more pressure from within those republics calling for Russian help. I also think that we saw in December a peace plan that Russia put forward saying, here are some of the issues that we urgently need to discuss. And the fact that that wasn't taken seriously at all, it was just totally dismissed by the US and the West. There were two separate ones. One was to the European countries, and the other was to the US, both dismissed. I think gave Putin the understanding that there was not going to be any chance of negotiations. I think that it was a terrible mistake to go in, but I understand the frustration on the part of Russians of not being able to get the attention of the West to seriously discuss these issues.
And so there's nothing specific a month or 2 or 3 months before the actual invasion that prompted. There were no specific action coming from either signs of NATO enlargement, signs that Zelensky, I remember there was at one point that Zelensky was also talking about, we've given up nuclear weapons, we want to have nuclear weapons back again. There were no immediate pressure. It was simply what you're saying is Putin had reached the point after 20 years of saying, I'm asking to be taken seriously. I want to talk about a kind of a new security structure for Europe, and I've just simply been flatly ignored. And this is the moment.
Well, I think there were more efforts on the part of Ukraine to try to really enter NATO. There was more military buildup that had been going on. There were larger military exercises that were being conducted, and there were bases from the US one put in Poland that was 100 miles from Russia's border. So I think all of those kind of military buildups were part of the problem, as well as the increased fighting that was happening in Donbass at the time.
Yeah, I don't want to put you on the spot there or put you in a corner here, but what would you say if I ask you, would you agree that there was a point that you kind of understand that this is where the buck stops for Putin, that you understand his motivation?
Well, I'm a peace activist. I'm an anti-war person, so I in no way justify one country invading the territorial integrity of another country, trying to solve these issues that were already military conflicts in which people were dying through more death and destruction. I don't understand Putin's strategy in terms of coming in from 3 different sides in Ukraine, going towards the capital. I have no idea if he thought it was going to be really easy to take over and install a pro-Russian leader, or it was just a ruse to try to get the Ukrainian troops confused about where Russia was going and then get back to protecting and expanding the area around the Donbass. I don't know, but I don't think that I can say that I understand Russia saying there was no more possibility of doing anything other than invasion. I always think there's something else that could be done.
Yeah. My next question, in March this year, the Russian and Ukrainians sat around the table for a peace deal. They were the opportunity for a peace deal. By all accounts, they came to some sort of an agreement. Even Zelensky seemed to be prepared to talk at this point. However, it was all scuttled by Boris Johnson arriving a day or two later in Kiev and saying to Zelensky, no deal. And then I go to the words of the American Senator Lindsey Graham, a guy that we all know is always ready for a fight, who said that the US and its allies will fight this war till the last man standing in Ukraine. I guess my question here is, what is America's ultimate goal here? I think we all understand that this is really also a proxy war. It's a war between Russia and America and its Western allies. But why is this war so important for Washington? Why is Washington prepared to go so far to actually, well, at the very least, get the Russians out of Ukraine and, I guess, push Russia back? What is the importance of this war for the Americans? What's in it for you?
I think if you look at it in the larger geopolitical structure, there's nothing in it for the American people, but for U.S. interests, whether they're energy interests or the weapons business, which is big business in the United States. There is an interest in cutting Europe off from Russia and putting it back squarely in the realm of the United States as its major trading partner, and the U.S. also being concerned that the main adversary that our government is telling the people is the Chinese. So weakening Russia in order to not have Russia be a strong partner for China. So I think in the geopolitical level, it's all of those machinations to maintain U.S. hegemony in the world and ultimately to confront China. There's also, you see how the Western energy interests, particularly the United States, has been trying to take advantage of the sanctions against Russian energy and get in there quickly to fill these markets that were being supplied by the Russians.
At enormously high prices.
Yes. And you also see how the U.S., in particularly the last 2 administrations, has been pressuring the Europeans to spend more of their money on militarism, to, quote, fulfill the NATO goal of having 2% of the gross national product at least going towards the military. Now, if you look at what that means buying U.S. weapons.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been a tremendous boon to the U.S. weapons industry, not only because of all the money that the U.S. is spending now to send these weapons to Ukraine, but also because the Europeans are now spending hundreds of billions of dollars more on weapons that they will be buying mostly from the United States, because within NATO, there has to be a interoperability to be able to have the militaries work together. So, those are some reasons I would say that the U.S. is posing this as such an important security interest to the American people and to the West, and saying it even in the terms that, of course, that, we are defending democracy in Ukraine so that Russia will not take over the Baltic states and expand. This is about worldwide democracy. But I think we have to put it much more in the terms of this is about U.S. trying to hold on to its quickly fading hegemony.
Yeah. And also the way I look at it, cash, dollars. Am I naive or rather silly if I say that there's also, of course, what happens after the war, the reconstruction of the country, that also means millions and billions of dollars of business for, certainly American companies as well? Or is that a naive statement?
Well, that's interesting because it's not talked about. In fact, when it's talked about, it's often like, how are we going to get Russia to pay reparations?
Yeah.
But even if the money is coming from frozen assets that Russia has in different parts of the West, or it's coming from Western governments, you're right. Who is going to get the contracts to rebuild is going to be a big mass competition for these very lucrative rebuilding contracts, because they're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild now.
Massive infrastructure that needs to be rebuilt as well. This is not only a war fought with blood, sweat, and tears, but it's also a massive propaganda war, with the Western media, of course, insisting that the Russians are on the run. A desperate Vladimir Putin is hiding in his bunker. It's very hard for us to figure out what's really going on the battlefield. I don't know if you have any idea. Are you able to give us any kind of an assessment? I know that you're not a military expert or anything like that, but what you hear and the people that you talk to, what is the talk about the situation on the ground? I know it comes down to the silly question of, are the Russians really losing and running with their tails between their legs now, or will they finally prevail in what they try to do here?
Well, I think we can listen to the man who is presently the highest military advisor to President Biden, who is the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Milley.
Yeah. And
he has said that the Ukrainians have done a heroic job in beating the Russians back, but now they're at a standstill, and that this will not be won on the battlefield. Mm-hmm. We have, you say I'm not an expert in the military, but I'm an expert in the military propaganda, because I've been through so much of it in my lifetime, and seen that for 20 years in Afghanistan and almost that long in Iraq, we were told that victory was around the corner. We just had to send in some more troops or throw in some more money and we would be victorious. So I think that any astute person who looks at the history of war propaganda and what we call the fog of war will try to sift through this and recognize that every time there is a gain on the battlefield for the Ukrainians, that is quite a significant gain. It is responded to by the Russians with a significant retaliation. And more recently, that's been in the form of the destruction of the infrastructure, so that now Zelensky says 10 million Ukrainians, a third of the population, are left without electricity, and many of them without running water. What will this mean as the winter sets in? Yeah. So I think on both sides, you have to recognize that Putin has staged his reputation on that. He's not going to pick up his troops and go home and say, "Oh, sorry, we lost that one." And Zelensky has now taken a maximalist position, saying we want every inch of Ukraine back. And he has empowered the hardliners in his government and in his military. So that's why the situation is so dangerous. And that's why it will not end on the battlefield, because neither side will give in. And it will only go on and perhaps extend to a nuclear war or a third world war if the people of the world don't rise up, including people inside the countries that are parties to this conflict, to say enough.
Yeah. Yeah, but I also want to take you back to what you said, General Milley said. I think one of the comments that he made that I picked up on was, in fact, that it would be very, very hard for Ukraine to actually reclaim what they call the sovereignty of the whole land. That seems to me like a slight little crack that is in the kind of presentation that we've heard so far from the Austins and the General Milleys. The recent missile strike on Poland, immediately, of course, blamed on Russia, brought us very close to obviously a NATO involvement. Some people started crying out the beginning of World War III. But Zelensky's insistence that it was a Russian strike, and subsequently that was found to be a blatant lie, also led to some what I call pretty healthy criticism from the West. My question is going back to that crack in the wall. Are we seeing the first cracks in the wall in terms of the Washington, the Western alliances' willingness to continue with their commitment? We have, for the first time, people saying Zelensky is lying to us. We're beginning to hear a slightly altered, slightly different kind of language in the Western media.
Yes, I think that was so significant when he immediately said this was Russia, and that was reported in a lot of the press that this was coming from Russia. And many of us thought, this is what we dreaded. It's going to expand the war to a direct confrontation with NATO. And luckily, that wasn't the case. And yes, there was a sense of frustration that was coming from Washington that Zelensky was so anxious to prove that it was Russian and get the West directly involved. And that is a crack, but there are other cracks. And the other cracks are something that we just discussed about the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I mean, he didn't lose his job. And that is significant. When he came out and said something that seemed very different from what the Biden administration had been putting out, it seems like it must have been coordinated with the Biden administration. And then let's recognize that particularly in Europe, there are cracks. There is what's being called Ukraine fatigue because the Europeans are suffering so much from the price of energy, from the inflation. And in the United States, we just had an election where the Republicans are now controlling the House and Congress. And there has been a lot more of griping and groaning from the extreme right side of the Republican Party about what they say is a blank check towards Ukraine. And this is not only about sending the weapons, this is about what amounts to about $2 billion a month that the U.S. is spending to keep the Ukrainian government in power economically. And so how long can that go on is a big question. And as the winter comes on, and that's why Milley said winter is a good time when should be an ease in the fighting to go to seize the moment at the negotiation.
Also one of those things I picked up, yes.
Yeah, this is really a time when we're seeing that there are many people realizing that if this just keeps dragging on, it will be there will be more opposition in the Western public as well as in the public of the United States.
Yeah, my next and last question also touches a little bit on this. This will be my last question. It's winter in Europe. 40% of the electricity power plants, the power grid in Ukraine has been destroyed. The country's economy is on the brink of collapse. 300,000 Russian soldiers are mobilizing. They have, in fact, mobilized, trained, ready to join the battle again when the winter, the cold allows it. Europe is expecting economic problems. A lot of people are saying that we are going to have at least 3 million more Ukrainian refugees. Some say even up to 8 million refugees coming to Europe. Which brings me to the point that at some point peace will have to come, and there will be peace talks at the end of the day. Now, I know once again it's very, very difficult for you perhaps to give me an answer to this, but what does peace look like to you? What do you think are likely to be the terms of this peace agreement? And I know we can't look into the crystal ball, but what will be the gains for Russia, and what will be the gains or the losses for Ukraine? What will be the outcome, do you think, of a final peace agreement?
Well, it's many of these were outlined in the talks that Ukraine and Russia were having in late March and early April. Mm-hmm. And the big one is that Ukraine would agree to be a neutral country, which is absolutely necessary, and that there would be guarantees from strong international countries that they would come in to support Ukraine if indeed they were invaded again, that Russian troops would leave, that there would be an internationally monitored referendum in the Donbass to decide whether Donbass would indeed continue to be a part of Ukraine, but autonomous, whether it would be independent or whether it would be part of Russia. And the issue of Crimea, that was talked about early on as something that could be put aside because there wasn't fighting going on in Crimea. Yeah. Because it does have such a long history of being part of Russia, that eventually there could be internationally monitored referenda there as well, but that didn't have to be dealt with immediately. And then I think that there are issues that the US/West and Russia have to talk about, which includes Russia's legitimate security interests, the bases that are surrounding Russia, the 5 European countries that have U.S. nuclear and missiles there, and the arms treaties that have been negotiated, but Trump had pulled out of between the U.S. and Russia. And then there are the sanctions that really only the U.S. and the Western countries can lift as part of negotiations. So I think the negotiations have to happen on those 2 levels, directly between Russia and Ukraine, and then separately between Russia and the U.S. and NATO. But I do want to say one more thing before we close up, which is that while we talk about the growing divisions happening in Europe and a growing understanding that this war is going to hurt more and more people as it drags on, that when there was the talks, the General Assembly met at the United Nations this year, it was quite remarkable to see country after country coming up, and many of them condemning Russia, but also saying, we don't want to choose sides because it's not in our economic interest to do so. And there's only one side for us, and that's the side of peace. And so whether it was coming from South Africa or China or India or Brazil, large countries, significant economies, all of them saying, you all better figure out a way to sit down at the table and solve this problem. I think there is that global cry, because unlike other wars that are confined to one country, this war is really affecting the world economy, global inflation, looming global recession, and that the people of the world are really demanding a negotiation and ceasefire rather than an endless war.
Yeah. I'm going to just push this question in as well, Medea, if you don't mind. You sketched to me more or less what will be on the table, and I'm trying to translate that into practical terms of what will we have to agree to at the end of the day. And it does seem to me, if I have to then, and I know, we journalists are silly, we want winners and losers and things like that, but it will appear to me that at the end of all of this, there's a jolly good chance that Putin would have finally gotten at least to have the engagement that he wanted in terms of creating the European security structures, possibly going to maintain the parts of the eastern Ukraine that is now part of Russia, possibly holding Crimea. It would sound to me that Putin would have gotten what he aimed for. Or is
I
that
don't
unfair to say that?
I don't know. That remains to be seen. I think on the other level, Putin has lost a lot of international support, and NATO has been strengthened as a result of this, with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, with more of the budgets of the NATO countries going towards the military. So I wouldn't say that anybody will win from this war, except maybe those big weapons manufacturers and the oil companies that we talked about. I think it's pretty much a lose-lose situation. Yeah. If there's any silver lining, it might be that, yes, this infrastructure for European security would make the Europeans perhaps at last realize that they need their own security system, they need their own negotiations with Russia, and that NATO is not helpful for them as a security architecture for Europe, that really there needs to be one that is not run by the United States. Yeah. And, you know, the other thing that in a faint glimmer of hope for me as a anti-war activist is that people are more aware now of the threat of nuclear war than they have been in a long time. And the younger generation, who really had no idea about the threat of the nuclear war, is now coming to a bit more of an understanding, and that this treaty in the United Nations to ban nuclear weapons will hopefully get a new breath of air with as people around the world become more demanding that we address the existential threat of nuclear weapons and try to find out how we can get the nuclear states to join on the UN ban that would end all nuclear weapons. Yeah,
I'm going to really push for one last question. How do you experience the Western mainstream media's handling of this war? How balanced, how fair, in bringing both sides of the story that I always say is so important. What are your feelings about the way in which the Western media is handling this story?
I think it's been atrocious, and it's so bad that the even people that I would consider part of a peace movement over many years have now been convinced by our media that you can't talk to Putin, have totally unaware of the fact that talks were going on and were blown up by the West, totally unaware that even during this war, there have been talks about getting the grain out of Ukraine, successful ones, getting the International Atomic Energy Agency into the Zaporizhia plant, successful ones about prisoner swaps, that these are all examples of, yes, you can and must talk to the other sides. That's what negotiations are all about. When they say you can't talk to Putin, we go back to the beginning of this interview where you talk about how the West has constantly villainized the oppositions and personalized it to make Saddam Hussein into Hitler, to make Gaddafi into Hitler, to make Putin into Hitler. And that so distorts the situation and so clouds not only what gave rise to this war, because I think for the American people, the U.S. has no part in setting the context for this, but it also makes the solutions totally unrealistic if indeed it's all about crushing Putin. So the media has been terrible at this, and has also refused to allow voices like myself that have a new book and would like to get op-eds in the major papers. Yep. People like Jeffrey Sachs with tremendous legitimacy, people like John Mersheimer, like Noam Chomsky. Yep. There's lots of us who have been writing very rational books and articles about this, who can't get our voices into the mainstream press in the United States. And that just keeps the American people in the dark about the reality of what's going on and what could be accomplished.
Yeah. I spoke to Professor Sachs myself, and I witnessed how 2 weeks later he was brutally cut off in some interview on one of the American stations. Medea Benjamin, it has been a great pleasure. It is a great honor to meet you, a great honor to talk to you. Thank you very, very much. And best of luck with the book. I hope that we will, who knows, maybe in the future, have the chance to talk again. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you so much.